Imagine waking up one morning to discover your own land has been turned into something from a science fiction film. That is exactly what occurred to retired landscape architect Arthur Davies, sometimes known as Art. I was staring at a shockingly 169 industrial solar panels set on my property without permission. You did really hear me correctly, on my land. The same ground from which I pay taxes, a mortgage, and have the legal deed. Now, let me take you on a journey loaded with entitlement, overreach, and payback like you have never seen before. You are wondering, how did this happen? Comment below and let me know whether your HOA has ever acted this ridiculous. Your handling of it was excellent. This all began several years ago when my wife Clara and I chose to purchase the lovely Lakeside Harmony Estates as our permanent residence. Surrounded by mature trees, a nearby lake, and a large lot that felt like the ideal canvas for my landscaping aspirations, this is a quiet area. Exactly what I wanted was a calm haven complete with native flora and birds. But little did I know, this peaceful neighborhood was a haven for something far darker. Under the imposing Brenda McLaughlin, the HOA rapidly displayed its actual colors. All of them were about control, down to the last detail, including the exact shade of green for my trim, which, by the way, wasn't on the allowed palette. Brenda's initial assault? A little offense on the color of my geraniums. As you know, the red ones. Only the patriotic red would supposedly do. Still, it was not limited there. Oh, not at all. A few weeks later, the HOA sent us a newsletter that seemed to radiate with all the typical green buzzwords about energy independence. The drawback was that there was no specifics, no consultation, no detail. Just a nebulous pledge that they would engage in significant green activity. Of course, nobody had sought for my opinion. I naturally grabbed the HOA paperwork, those holy guidelines and norms every homeowner is required to abide by. And try to guess what I discovered. Not a mention of any such community green project, devoid of my approval. There seems to be something wrong. Then arrived the day of death. While cutting my roses, a peaceful act of revolt against their strict guidelines, I observed something strange. Walking on the HOA land adjacent to mine with surveying tools were two men sporting bright vests. I asked them casually what they were up to. The response is here. Infrastructure, they declared, but they were evasive. My instincts shouted, and I realized this was more than just another modern park or playground. The actual bombshell fell on Monday. In a panic, Clara called me and said, "Art, you have to come home right now. There are vehicles. Large vehicles. And they're on our lawn." I hurried home to discover a bulldozer on our land, along with flatbed trucks emptying hundreds of solar panels. Hundreds of them like an invading army. I went straight to the foreman. What I discovered? A straightforward job, with a directive to set up a commercial solar farm on my property. My homeland. The foolishness. This was my backyard, exactly the place I had imagined as a peaceful haven, a wildflower meadow maybe with a bench for contemplation. This went beyond a simple mistake. It announced war on my rights as a property owner. Then Brenda McLaughlin, the Queen, came up in her pearl-white Cadillac Escalade, obstructing my driveway as if she owned the house. She informed me I should be thrilled to have a solar farm on my land. Apparently, this was all for the good of the community, and she advised me not to be so dramatic. She smiled smugly. She even tried to persuade me that a portion of my land was wild and unproductive, as though that would be okay to seize for a business green project. The worst part, though, was that she handed me a site plan. A joke, some hurriedly sketched lines on a napkin-like piece of paper. Her arrogant behavior and false claims regarding an easement to build this solar farm? Perfect fiction. On my deed, no such easement existed. This went beyond merely a privacy infringement. It was total contempt for my rights. The worst of all is also Brenda felt she had all the authority, and that I was merely another housewife to walk over. She had no idea, though, I was about to make sure she cannot get away with it. This went beyond solar panels as well. It concerned defending what is mine. The lines of conflict were exactly on my own grass. And thus the quiet war started. As I walk you through the turns of defending my rights, property, and tranquility, keep tuned. Although I have dealt with a lot of zoning rules, boundary conflicts, and easement fights, nothing could have readied me for this. Although my area of expertise is ecological design, when it comes to property rights, I knew just what had to be done. The first step is get my formal property survey, something I had painstakingly saved, of course. Sitting at the dining room table, I was tracing the boundary lines with my finger while Clara watched nervously over my shoulder. It was absolutely clear. My property was definitely mine. The section of my future wildflower meadow Brenda McLaughlin's bulldozers were destroying? Indeed, 100% my land. This fresh clarity drove me on my counteroffensive. I first went to the office of the county recorder to ask for copies of all HOA incorporation records and the Lakeside Harmony Estates master plan. I ran across David Chen, a quiet software programmer from down the street, there who had already run-ins with Brenda about her perfectly approved welcome mats. Solar panel dispute? He speculated. I shook my head. Brenda McLaughlin is a force of nature, he said, smirkingly. Possibly a natural disaster as well. David was already on my radar as a possible ally, and his offer to assist explore the digital side of things was just what I needed. Thanks to him, I found something startling. The HOA had no authority to occupy my ground with a solar farm. Lakeside Harmony Estates' original master plan made very evident that the area surrounding my house was set aside as a natural buffer zone, never intended for development. I thus wrote a letter to the HOA board, including all the proof, the survey, the master plan, and gently but firmly asked that building on my property halt. The answer is with Brenda's easements to support them. A brusque letter from Doris, the HOA secretary, parroting that everything was good. I arrived nowhere. When I tried to talk at the next HOA meeting, Brenda shut me down right away, saying my arguments had nothing bearing on the agenda. She also had her crony, Big Stan Kowalski, physically obstruct me from handing copies of my proof. This was developing into a personal grudge, not a discussion. Brenda then, with a victorious smile, dropped the bomb. Phase 1 of our solar array is almost complete. The reductions on the clubhouse electrical cost already excite us. And it's all thanks to the, let me say, ideally located land that makes it possible. Rising faster than I could manage, the solar panels were invading my property like an unwelcome infection. My daily soundtrack became the sound of generators humming and metal clanging. Ever the rock, Clara always reminded me not to back off. She would remark, tightly clutching my hand. You know what's right, Art. But I was not going to let Brenda and her allies grind me down. It was time to visit the neighbors. Most of them were too afraid of Brenda's wrath, but I discovered several strong allies. Mrs. Henderson, an old woman who had lived in the neighborhood from its founding, revealed a vital memory. I remember when your lot was advertised for its privacy, she replied. If the original developer, Old Man Hemlock, realized what Brenda is doing, he would be spinning in his grave. My digital buddy David was really helpful. Investigating earlier projects and finding possible financial incentives connected to the Lakeside Harmony installation, he descended deeply into the solar business Brenda had hired. There's always a money trail, Art, he added, a glitter in his eye. I kept all of this under documentation during it. I recorded the building workers at work, took hundreds of time-stamped pictures illustrating the invasion of my territory, and maintained meticulous notes of every letter Brenda disregarded and contemptuous comment she made. I even fitted covert motion-activated security cameras to guard my property. Then I called on my friend Tom Allen, a semi-retired attorney with a negative opinion of HOAs. He wrote a cease and desist letter more tougher than mine. It clearly stated, in no doubt, the trespassing and violation of my property rights, requesting the instant evacuation of all tools and staff. Brenda's answer arrived through a clearly traumatized Doris, who grudgingly sent along Brenda's message. Her voice clearly revealed a conceit. This struggle was still under progress. Watch this space to see how I use all I have to fight back. There have never been more stakes. You know that feeling when you're told something is for the greater good, but you just know it's really about someone else's personal gain? That's exactly how I felt when Doris, the HOA secretary, awkwardly relayed Brenda McLaughlin's response to my legal communication. President McLaughlin received your letter, Doris stammered, refusing to make eye contact. She says the project is proceeding as planned for the benefit of the entire community. And she also said, and I quote, "Stop being such a Nemi and embrace the future." My blood ran cold. This was no more simply about property rights. It was about Brenda's unbridled hubris. Doris swallowed before adding, "She also says lawyers don't scare her. They just enrich the HOA's legal fund." By now the full 169 solar panels, yes, I counted every single one, had been installed on my property. They were an eyesore, gleaming and intrusive, gradually changing what should have been my peaceful, private retreat into an industrial zone. Their long shadows stretched across my yard every morning, and their faint electronic hum became a continual irritant. Worse, they were already altering the microclimate of my garden, shifting sun exposure patterns I had spent years cultivating. Meanwhile, David Chen, the quiet, sharp-witted software engineer I had met earlier, was doing some digging into the financials behind this project. What he uncovered was both infuriating and enlightening. Apparently, the state offered hefty rebates for community solar projects, but to maximize these rebates, a certain size of the solar array was required. The common area adjacent to my property, while sizable, was just shy of the necessary square footage. But by spilling onto my unused 50-foot strip of land, they managed to qualify for the top rebate tier. David showed me the figures on his laptop. Brenda sold this to the board based on those maximum rebates. And I bet you another $1 that she glossed over the details of where that extra land was coming from. His eyes glinted with a mix of amusement and indignation. Legal battles would be long, costly, and taxing. Brenda seemed to enjoy public conflict, as long as she controlled the narrative. But I needed a different approach, a quieter one, something she would not seen coming until it was too late. This was about money, not just about going green. Brenda looked like a hero using my land, my rights, as collateral. Her cruelty was casual, and her conviction was unshakable. One afternoon, as I sat on my patio marveling at those shining panels, a thought started to germinate. Solar panels depend on sunlight. What if I could block that sunlight? What if, instead of battling with steel and silicon, I could fight with nature itself? And just like that, the plan started to take shape. My professional knowledge as a landscape architect would be my weapon. I could plant an army of trees, not just a few shrubs here and there, but a carefully planned barrier to block the sunlight from hitting the panels. Slowly, gently, I would render those panels useless, an invading project undone by nature itself. I spent days researching local ordinances, zoning codes, and tree planting rules. I needed to ensure that my plan was legal, and what I found was even better than I expected. There were no height restrictions for trees planted on private residential property, as long as their trunks didn't encroach on neighboring land. The panels were on my land, and the trees would be on my land. Any shade they cast on the panels would be entirely within my rights. With that knowledge, I got to work firing my old design software and starting to design the ideal strategy. I would build a dense, year-round screen that would eventually block the maximum amount of sunlight from hitting those 169 panels. The panels wouldn't just be blocked by a few trees, they would be entirely eclipsed by an army of shade. For the front lines, I chose Thuja Green Giant, fast-growing, dense, and ideal for rapidly establishing shade, behind which I planned to plant slower-growing native hardwoods, oak, maple, and hornbeam. These trees would not only block the sun, but also provide long-term ecological benefits. And for some areas, I even considered broadleafed evergreens like southern magnolia, perfect for those areas that needed extra shade. The planting itself became a quiet operation, one I carried out over several weekends. Every tree I planted was a small victory, a step closer to turning Brenda's illegal solar array into an expensive, efficient eyesore. This was more than just a revenge plot. It was about creating a living, breathing ecosystem that would slowly undo the damage Brenda had done. This was about regaining what was mine and applying the very rules of nature to do it, not only about landscaping. Stay tuned. This fight is far from finished. It all started innocently enough. I hired a local nursery to deliver dozens of young trees, everything from sturdy saplings to more established specimens, to give my project a head start. David Chen, my ever-supportive ally, came over to help, under the guise of just assisting an old guy with some yard work. Together with Clara, who kept the iced tea flowing and offered moral support, we dug, planted, mulched, and watered. It looked like just another landscaping project to the casual observer, but what Brenda McLaughlin didn't know was that these trees were going to become her worst nightmare. Brenda drove past several times in her gleaming Escalade during our planting sessions. I noticed her slow down once, her lips pursing in that familiar, disdainful sneer. She probably thought I was finally cleaning up the wild and unproductive part of my yard, exactly what she had once generously decided to improve. What she didn't realize was that these saplings were far more than they appeared. They were soldiers in a quiet war, and their future mission was already set in motion. I could almost hear her thinking, "Bless his heart," as if she were seeing me try to pretty up the space around her magnificent solar farm. The irony of it all was like a warm blanket on a cold day. "Doing a bit of planting, Arthur?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her gaze sweeping over the young trees now planted across my yard. I simply smiled and responded, "Just adding a little more green to the neighborhood, Mrs. Henderson. Good for the soul." My elderly friend Mrs. Henderson ambled over one afternoon, with a small basket of freshly baked cookies and a knowing glint in her eye. Her words were quiet encouragement, and as she patted my arm, she added, "Trees are patient, dear. And they grow. Remember that." And as I worked, I kept meticulous records, receipts for every tree, soil amendment, and mulch purchase. I documented every step of the planting process, noting specific dates and tree locations. This would be my irrefutable evidence if any issues with tree ordinances came up. Brenda, it seemed, was so focused on enforcing her made-up bylaws about paint colors and lawn ornaments that she completely overlooked the far more powerful and legal tools a homeowner like me had at their disposal. As the last tree, a young oak that I hoped would one day tower over Brenda's solar panels, was planted, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the explosive victory of a courtroom battle. It was quieter, more organic. I had sown the seeds of my revenge, quite literally, and now all I had to do was nurture my green army and wait. Over time, I would watch as Brenda's multi-million-dollar solar farm slowly starved in the shade, the sun she sought to harness so imperiously on my land now blocked by my trees. Brenda herself did not seem overly concerned. She occasionally mentioned my landscaping efforts at HOA meetings, as if I were simply adding some aesthetic value to her beloved solar panels. Little did she know that each inch my saplings grew was a quiet victory, a little encroachment on the sunlight she had stolen from me. The first few months after planting felt almost normal, at least on the surface. Neighbors noticed the changes, but most of them just dismissed it as Art Davies working on his reduced yard. The row of thuja green giants closest to Brenda's solar panels started casting dappled shade in the mornings and late afternoons by the second spring and summer. It was not a total blackout yet, but I could almost picture Brenda and her board poring over confusing energy reports, scratching their heads, likely blaming cloud cover, dust, or faulty equipment, anywhere but the simple line of greenery growing steadily on my property. By the third year, the transformation was undeniable. The thuja green giants were now well over 10 feet tall, thick and verdant, forming an almost impenetrable wall. The oaks and maples were catching up, their canopies broadening, and their leaves casting increasingly dense shadows. The closest rows of Brenda's precious solar panels were now in partial or full shade for significant portions of the day. The panels that should have been soaking up sunlight to power Brenda's community were now struggling, and the very sunlight they had claimed was now fueling the growth of my defiant, beautiful trees. I almost choked on my coffee reading that mysterious issues indeed. The first official rumble from the HOA came in the monthly newsletter. It was a panicked general notice about the solar array's unexpected underperformance. It urged residents to conserve energy to make up for the temporary shortfall. It even hinted at bringing in specialized technicians to diagnose the enigmatic problems. Brenda's white Escalade shrieked to a stop at the curb, and she emerged, her face thunderous, looking like a wasp whose nest had just been poked. I was enjoying a cup of tea on my patio, admiring how the light filtered through my growing trees, casting shadows over the once empty, sterile metal and glass. Suddenly, Brenda's Davies. Your overgrown bushes are interfering with vital community assets. This is sabotage. She marched up to the edge of my property, with big Stan Kowalski lumbering behind her like a confused bodyguard, ready to enforce whatever decree Brenda had in mind. Your overgrown bushes are interfering with whatever civility Brenda had in mind. I sipped my drink slowly, then got up and walked gently, approaching Brenda. Good morning, Brenda. Stan. My voice was even, measured. First of all, these aren't bushes. They're trees. Second, they're on my land. And third. I hesitated, letting the weight of my words sink in. Brenda's fury reached new heights when she arrived at my property, face flushed with outrage. You did this on purpose, she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. You planted these weeds to block our solar panels. You are costing this community money, and you will cut them down. You will cut them down today. Brenda, I don't recall any HOA bylaw that dictates the specific location or height of trees on my own private property, especially when they're well maintained and dawns pose no threat to anyone else's land. These trees you see are improving my property. And the shade they provide, well, that's just a natural byproduct of the trees growing. Nothing malicious about it. Stan moved forward, heaving his chest. Cut them down, Davies. She means you cut them down. I looked at Stan, then back at Brenda, holding my ground. Are you threatening me, Stan? Are you suggesting you intend to come onto my private property and damage my trees? Because that would be trespassing and destruction of property. And I assure you, I'll involve the authorities immediately. I even have excellent footage from my security cameras documenting our past encounters and the ongoing situation. Stan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Brenda's fury was still palpable, but she took a brief pause, perhaps taken aback by the mention of my security cameras. Then, her anger flared again. This is an outrage. She spat. You're attacking the community. There are rules about landscaping that obstruct common elements. Indeed there are, I said in a friendly tone. But the main difference is that these trees are blocking elements on my land that were placed there without my permission. That's the key difference, don't you think? Brenda stormed off, vowing to bring the full force of the HOA down on me. And just as I expected, the official notices started flooding in. The first was a friendly reminder to trim shrubbery that might be impeding common infrastructure. The next was a formal violation notice, citing a vague bylaw about maintaining landscaping in a neat and orderly condition and demanding immediate pruning of my trees. We quoted sections from the CC and RS, pointing out the lack of any covenant preventing me from allowing trees to cast shadow on my own land. The whole situation was starting to feel like a dark comedy. My attorney Tom helped me draft polite but firm responses, stressing that the trees were healthy, well-maintained, and totally on my property. Brenda wasn't finished yet. She tried to get the HOA's landscaping contractor, run by Big Stan's cousin, to come onto my property and remedy the situation. I caught them as they pulled up, told them they were about to trespass, pointed out my no trespassing signs, and let them know everything was being recorded. After a nervous phone call, they sheepishly retreated. The core issue, as Tom kept reminding Finch, wasn't my trees. It was the solar panels illegally occupying my property. Brenda's lawyer, Lionel Finch, sent increasingly threatening missives. Tom countered each one with cool logic and irrefutable facts. The legal letters flew back and forth like angry paper planes. Meanwhile, my arboreal army was quietly and relentlessly doing its job. More and more rows of panels fell victim to the shade, and the total energy output from the 169 panels was likely plummeting. David Chen, always the resourceful strategist, dug into some publicly available data on the community solar project and confirmed my suspicions. Their overall figures are tanking, he grinned. There's a section in the report about significant underperformance in Sector Gamma. I'm pretty sure Sector Gamma is your backyard. David, always the tech-savvy strategist, started an anonymous online forum thread titled, Discussing Lakeside Harmony Energy Efficiencies. It quickly became a coded space for residents to share their observations about Brenda's shady behavior and the mounting issues with the solar project. The whispers around the neighborhood started to turn into chuckles. Some neighbors, inspired by my defiance, started subtly complimenting my beautiful new privacy screen. Support for her cause was quietly growing, though many were still too afraid to voice it openly for fear of Brenda's wrath. Once the queen of lakeside harmony, Brenda was beginning to seem more like a laughingstock. Her green revolution was becoming a farce as the strain on her grew. And cornered animals are dangerous. Whispers became pointed questions at HOA meetings. The promised savings were nowhere to be found in the budget reports. The HOA was losing money on the project, especially when considering the maintenance costs for underperforming panels and Lionel Finch's mounting legal fees. The breaking point was not an explosion, but the relentless accumulation of pressure. Brenda Speak said she was going to railroad through a vote to sue me into oblivion, or pass some ridiculous retroactive bylaw about solar obstruction. She felt the weight of her crumbling empire and decided to double down. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and the notice, in bold capital letters, proclaimed the purpose was, discuss urgent matters pertaining to the continuous viability and protection of community assets. Certain it would be desperate, this was the confrontation I had been training for, the result of 3 years of silent resistance and painstaking preparation. I was ready. More residents than usual had turned out, drawn by the scent of approaching drama. The meeting took place in the community clubhouse, a room typically reserved for potlucks and Brenda's self-congratulatory award ceremonies. Clara, my steadfast friend, was by my side. Mrs. Henderson gave me a brave wave from the front, and David nodded subtly in support. Brenda, brilliant in a screaming pink power suit, started the conference with a 15-minute diatribe. She painted me as a sinister saboteur, a selfish person purposefully undercutting the community's valiant efforts toward a greener future. She spoke of my hostile vegetation and the significant financial damage my actions were causing upon every homeowner. Then came the bombshell. Lionel Finch's expert legal opinion, alleging I clearly violated at least 3 recently created CCR clauses about interference with common property. She sharply demanded the board approve an immediate lawsuit to remove my trees and seek punitive damages for her malicious campaign against the HOA.